Hi, ladies. This is just a quick, basic run through of some information about climate. Honestly, just to save us a little bit of time so that hopefully we can touch on all the other highlights from chapters 4 and 5 in one class session. So, climate, though, I don't want to ignore because it probably is the most important abiotic factor when it comes to the environment around us. You'll recall that abiotic factors are things that are not living. And so when we talk about interactions with our surroundings, climate generally plays about the biggest role in where we can live, how well organisms can survive in a given area, and what type of organisms will survive in a given area. Now, probably the most important thing to take away from this is this first point, which is the difference between climate and weather. So, the first thing that you absolutely have to know is that climate is not the same thing as weather. And this is a common mistake that people make. Also, if I were to ask you on homework or on a test, to define climate for me, one of the worst things you could do is use the word weather. So you want to avoid this. Now, what is the difference? The weather is what you might check on weather.com or you might see reported on the local news. I might have mentioned this already. Kevin Harned is the chief meteorologist at Wave 3 in town, and he's a family friend of ours. It's a long story. I also think he's related somehow to Miss Crowdis that teaches biology at Mercy. But, Kevin is a meteorologist, and so what he is an expert in is reporting the weather and predicting the weather. And so the weather is the day-to-day conditions on Earth's atmosphere in a very particular place. So, for instance, right here in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, weather is generally a reporting of the temperature and whether or not it's going to rain, right? If you think about what you see on the news. But weather can change really quickly from one day to the next. So, for instance, we've experienced this year, and we've been experiencing a lot in the last few years. It can go easily from 75, 80 degrees and sunny here in September or October to the next day the high is 50 and it's cold. Or in a given day, it can be really nice and sunny, and then the next thing you know, it's pouring down rain. That's weather. Climate is different. Right? Climate is more of a year-to-year pattern, or sometimes we look at it from month to month, or month to month. And climate involves two things. That's the average temperature and the average precipitation. So we're looking at the same concepts here. How warm is it, and is it going to rain? But for climate, we're talking about this big picture, consistent kind of idea. So, for instance, instead of just saying, what's the climate today, like we would for weather, we would ask, what's the average climate in Kentucky in November? And so I would say, for November, if we're talking about Louisville, Kentucky, we probably have an average daytime temperature around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And I would guess that we're probably talking about 4 inches of rainfall. Right? And that would be an example of climate. Notice that doesn't change abruptly. It's not that it's 60 degrees now, but it'll be 40 degrees tonight. We're just saying, here's the average temperature, here's the average precipitation that we might get. And that is climate. Now, the last thing here on this slide before we move on, this would be an example of a climate map. Kentucky, Indiana, they're kind of boring on the climate map, so I chose California here. With this, they use different colors, and this is tiny, to show differences in temperature and precipitation. So California is great as an example because in Southern California, it's very hot and very dry or arid. Northern California, it's very cool and very damp. So very big differences in color on this. Now, this climate map differs from a climatograph. which we will be seeing in our homework, and we'll leave that for another time. Now, climate can range very widely from region to region, but ultimately there are three major things that determine the climate of a given area. And those three things are the solar energy that gets trapped in our biosphere, latitude, one way to determine your location on Earth, and then also currents. And so let's take a look at each of these three things. First, this solar energy trapping has a name, and that name is the greenhouse effect. So when sunlight comes into our atmosphere, it gets absorbed, and some of that solar energy gets trapped near the Earth's surface, keeping the Earth warm. We call it the greenhouse effect because it functions sort of like a greenhouse would that we would use to grow plants here in the upper part of this picture. A greenhouse is made of a particular type of glass that allows sunlight in and allows sunlight out. But the thermal energy, the heat, doesn't get back out. It gets trapped inside that little glass house. And so then, even if it's cold outside, if it's sunny, a greenhouse can be very warm and plants can grow very successfully. Our atmosphere works much in the same way, but instead of glass, we have greenhouse gas. So I'd like you to remember three gases: carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, and water vapor. These three gases are the three primary greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And then if you look at this picture here, they work like greenhouse gas. So we've got this layer here of greenhouse gases, and the sunlight can pass in, as you see in this picture, and the light can actually come back out. But a lot of that heat is going to get absorbed back in to Earth's surface. So in other words, the greenhouse effect, which involves these gases, is responsible for warming the surface of the Earth to a point that it's actually inhabitable by us and other animals and plants. Now, as you might guess, the more greenhouse gas you have, the warmer the average temperature will be. So this might explain why sometimes it's warmer in certain parts of the world if there's more carbon dioxide production there because of pollution. And this might have something to do with global climate change, but we'll talk about that later as well. And then fun fact that you may already know, or maybe not. Number one source of methane, farm animals, because methane is in your toots. All right, second factor that helps determine climate is latitude. Now, I realize like in geography, you may have spoken about latitude and longitude. Quite frankly, we don't care about longitude in biology. We're only focused on latitude. Now, latitude describes your location based on your distance from the equator or the midline of the Earth, sort of from east to west is the way to think of it. Now, why, right? Well, actually, this one has everything to do with solar energy also. Sunlight is much more concentrated and much more intense and more direct near the equator. And it is less intense and more spread out at the poles. So, as you might guess, we're going to see warmer temperatures the closer we are to the equator because sunlight and solar energy is more intense there. So at lower latitudes, closer to the equator, we see warmer climates. At higher latitudes, farther from the equator, like at the poles, we see cooler climates. And latitude allows us to break the Earth down into three different climate zones: tropical, temperate, and polar. Now, you have these, we say it's three zones, but you got a north version and a south version of each one. So for instance, the tropical zone as you can see right here, ranges from the equator out to about 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. And again, this would be your warmest or hottest zone. The temperate zones, right, are going to range from about 23.5 degrees to 66.5 degrees, both on the northern side and the southern side. And then the polar zones are going to run from that, roughly 67 degree mark out to 90 degrees, or the poles, north and south. And they would be the coolest. So I don't think this will be hard to remember, because you probably kind of already know these things. But tropical is warmer, polar is cooler, and then you got temperate in between. Now, the last piece that helps determine climate is currents. And these could be both wind currents or ocean, aka water currents. Now, I really don't expect you to know a lot about this. These can be very complicated, and we could go to a deeper level, but your textbook doesn't really do that, and I don't think it's something that's worth spending a lot of time on either. So, just in general, you want to know that air and water will really help move around heat, right, or sort of the lack thereof. Now, one thing I do want you to kind of understand is how air works, right? You probably already know that heat rises. So let's say here we are on our planet. All right, so I'll draw a little picture here, and this is awful. As air moves up, right, or warm air moves up, right, heat rises. It eventually, these molecules expand. And as they expand, then the air will cool off and it will sink back down. Right? So cool air sinks. And you might already kind of know this from like your heater or your air conditioning, right? Cool air sinks and warm air rises. Well, when this cool air sinks, you can think of air almost like it's a solid thing. And if we have this kind of column of air coming down and it hits the Earth's surface, it's going to push the air that was below it one direction or another, right, on that surface. And that's what wind is. Right? And then wind, usually as it moves along the surface of the earth, actually picks up some heat and warms back up, and then you kind of start over this process that I've drawn. So wind can go in all different directions. It has to do with this heating and cooling effect. And Earth's rotation sort of helps determine the direction of the wind currents, and this has a lot to do with just where you are located on the planet. Now, for us in the temperate zone, wind usually flows from west to east. So if you think about looking at a weather radar maybe on TV, usually the storms and stuff are going to move from left to right across your screen. And that's because wind currents are usually from west to east. But that's not always true, right? If you watch the news long enough, you'll find one that kind of looks more north to south. You'll find ones that come up from the tropics, particularly during hurricane season, and all kinds of different stuff. But again, that's why we're not going to go into this in too great a depth. But you've probably heard of some currents before, but the currents you've maybe heard of are probably ocean currents. All right, so here's an ocean current map down here in the corner. All these different crazy arrows are showing you different currents that we can see. And maybe the one that's been made the most famous now is the EAC dudes, right, from Nemo, the East Australian current. But what I really would like you to take away from this is just these pieces here. You can have ocean currents that are either deep or surface. Deep currents, because light cannot penetrate there, right? We've got no sun getting down to that deep water. Deep currents are always cold, and they tend to originate from the poles or the polar zones where it's cooler. Surface currents, however, can be warm or cold, and that's why you've got all these different colored arrows in this picture. Surface currents are affected by sunlight, and then those surface currents of water actually affect air temperature. Right? So if a cool surface water current is heading toward a coast, it's going to bring with it, it's going to cool the air above it and then push that cool air onto land. And so it can cause, a decrease in the land climate in an area adjacent to where there is a cooler or warmer ocean current. So that takes care of climate for us. Big things you got to remember. It is a big thing. It's average temperature and precipitation, and it is very different than weather, right? So not weather. And then there are three things that help shape our climate. That's the greenhouse effect, and make sure you know what that means. That's latitude, and that is currents. All right, I'll see you in class.